John Kurtz joins us, Kansas City Sports Network, with us on 365 Sports. So let's start with this, John, as far as Kansas State, who they are, what they've done. We had Chris Kleiman on the show. Has it been kind of a quiet yet very productive spring for them?
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I appreciate you having me on. I think the biggest storyline, honestly, has been just the fact that they protected the roster, didn't lose anybody here in this spring portal, and really didn't lose anybody, honestly, in the winter portal that was all that consequential to the roster. I think they've just done a really good job at being organized, roster retention. Their GM has done a fantastic job, and it's just a really good, solid program right now. And Chris Kleiman's been a guy who's kind of been ahead of the curve on like downplaying the importance of a spring game. Like going back to the beginning of his time at K-State, he was wanting to not do a spring game, which really ruffled some feathers then. And now it seems like everybody is kind of fallen in line with that, where that's more the route everybody is going. And they've even changed a little bit the structure of what they're doing in the spring, adding a little bit more to the workouts as opposed to practices because of the fact that they are going to Ireland early. They've tinkered with the schedule basically because they have that coming up with Iowa State. So I think, no, optimism's really high. I mean, look, we all saw the Nico Iamaleava thing play out at Tennessee and knew that Avery Johnson would probably be getting a call, and think he did and didn't entertain that for very long at all. So all seems to be good for a team that continues to add really nice pieces in the portal too. I guess that's another thing. You know, JB Nelson, they just added this weekend from Penn State. That's a guy who was a rotational player who was starting some at Penn State over the last 2 years on one of the best offensive lines in the country. And they really wanted to keep him. He was just competing for a starting spot with a couple of All-Americans. And they think James Franklin has a quote saying they think he's still an NFL guy. So they just added him as a guy who can play tackle or guard on the offensive line. So I've just been really impressed with the offseason that K-State has had.
One of those positions that they addressed heavily in the portal was wide receiver. And, you know, they've lost over the last couple of years, some very unsung dudes that were just catch machines. How much was that important as we hit Avery Johnson, year 2 as the starter, year 3 of his career, to expand that passing game?
Really important. And I think that that's the key to the season. Like they have done everything else just about that they could with the roster in terms of fortifying really strong position groups pretty much across the board to have the talent to compete for a Big 12 championship. But it won't happen if Avery Johnson does not take a big step forward. And I think that much is really obvious. Not just some of the turnovers and when things really snowballed. There were obviously 2 games, Houston and BYU, where that really happened. But they were also 90th in the country in 3-and-out percentage. There were just too many times where the offense, you know, just in a flash, you have a couple of plays that get screwed up really quick, and incompletion here, and then a loss of 2 yards, and bam, you're in 3rd and long, and the offense would be off the field before you knew it. And I think that was really a problem. There just was not enough consistently moving the chains throughout the year. Well, they did have, plenty of explosion because of what Avery Johnson brings to the table. So you've got to see that development happen. Now, I think he really likes Matt Wells. And so it was, in some ways, maybe a blessing in disguise that Matt Wells takes over as the offensive coordinator now. And so hopefully that will help. Hopefully just growth and maturity. Avery looks stronger. I mean, you can visually tell, like, he looks bigger. Maybe we'll be more willing to take on some contact when we're running the football this year. We'll see. The good news on the receiver front is, I mean, if I were to tell you the guys that have drawn the most buzz out of spring practice, I think the list starts with 2 receivers, and they're both transfers who weren't there last year. One is Jerron Tibbs from Purdue, and the other is Jaron Bradley, former Texas Tech Red Raider turned Boston College receiver last year. I mean, those guys, they just put out a video on social media. If you don't believe what I've heard from people inside the program, they just put a video on social media last week. It was one of those where they hold a cue card up with a question for the players as they're all walking by on their way to practice. And the question was just something like, who's been most impressive this spring? And I mean, like 75% of the guys there, they were talking about JB and Tibbs. So look, I mean, Bradley gives you size that K-State just really hasn't had at receiver in a long time. And obviously a proven track record in the Big 12 when he was tremendous a couple of years ago for Texas Tech as a freshman. It seems like he's re-energized, I mean, I think the relationship with Matt Wells there probably helps. And then Tibbs really came on toward the end of the year for Purdue last year, and that was obviously just not a very good situation, not a very good program. A lot of times guys could be far less productive than what they should be just because of the infrastructure that's around them. And so I think I would say with the fan base, a little more cautious optimism, okay, because K-State fans have been sold this type of thing on the receiving core before, and it hasn't worked out all that well. I mean, they have not had a really dynamic receiving core, to be honest, probably since Tyler Lockett left. 2022, Cade Warner was really good to go along with Malik Knowles. It might be the one blip on the radar screen, but really we're going on over a decade without a very dynamic receiver core. So you combine those two with Jace Brown, who had the best sophomore receiving season at K-State since Tyler Lockett last year, and you can start to really see, okay, this could come together and be much better. Plus, I mean, the tight end room is pretty stacked. I mean, they have 4 tight ends that caught touchdowns last year, and they're adding Lincoln Cure, who's a 5-star receiver or 5-star tight end that may play some more almost like an actual receiver as well. So they've got a lot of weapons in the passing game for Avery to work with for sure.
So, John, Jacob Parrish, DJ Giddens, Marcus Siegel all get drafted. Kleiman's had a pretty good stretch now of draft picks. I think it's 10 in the last 3 years, which is pretty solid. If you have any particular thoughts on those guys, feel free to share. But I noticed you had a video out, and I hadn't had a chance to catch it yet on just kind of the Big 12 and the draft. And so what were your feelings come out of this weekend on the K-State trio, but also, I guess, big picture stuff, if anything stood out to you in regards to the draft?
Yeah, I think on the K-State guys, the biggest point that I would make, and look, thrilled for all of them. I mean, DJ Giddens was a no-star recruit out of Junction City. Like back in my days of doing Manhattan High football games, I can remember Manhattan High playing Junction City and DJ Giddens being involved there. And I thought he was a nice player, but I did not think that he was going to be a guy that was going to get drafted and have as much production as he did at the Big 12 level. So you got to give him all the credit in the world for producing that. Really cool story. I think the bigger story for K-State is just the defensive backs that they have put in. And not just that, a lot of transfer defensive backs. Marquise Siegel is one that Kleiman said from the moment he got in the program, this is an NFL safety. And, some of us, Kleiman can be a little bit hyperbolic sometimes. He's just a guy that's going to love up his players. But he was right. I mean, this is one where he was definitely right. And you go back, almost every single year, they are putting a transfer defensive back into the NFL. Jacob Parrish was not a transfer. That was a local recruit out of Olathe North who just had crazy track speed and really grew and developed throughout his time at K-State, and he winds up going in the 3rd round. So that's another guy just to throw into the mix. But they, Joe Klanderman, Van Malone, the guys that have coached all these dudes in the secondary, and Kleiman, he's a safety coach by trade. They've just done a phenomenal job year in, year out. So I think that should give you some optimism for K-State's defensive backfield this year. The Big 12 as a whole, man, the problem here is, so I'm reading the Big 12 press release, and I'm like, okay, 31 draft picks, which is tied for the most since 2005. It was the same amount as they had last year. And I'm like, okay, well, on the surface, that sounds all right. Obviously, there's 4 more teams in the league now than there was in 2005. So that helps a little bit when you're trying for sheer raw numbers. But then, man, you just see it held up in comparison to what the SEC and Big Ten are doing. And they had 150 of the, 257 picks. But the most damning thing is the first round. They had 26 of the 32 first-round draft picks. That's staggering. And obviously, it's consolidation. You're adding more teams, and all the teams that are being added to the Big Ten and SEC are teams that funnel in talent like crazy. So, of course, those numbers were going to go up and look like that. But yeah, I'm listening to Josh Pate do his show last night, and he starts it by saying, we gotta stop saying that, that the Big Ten and the SEC are playing the same sport as everybody else, because it's just so much different in terms of talent. And yes, there's a part of me that gets a little bit triggered at that. And hey, come on, man. Arizona State was literally 1 play away from beating Texas in the college football playoff last year. Let's not forget that. But at the same time, if you're talking about just league wide, what you're doing week in, week out with all those teams there in the conference. I mean, it is a pretty staggering difference in terms of the talent level that is there with those two. You have to admit, and you also know that when you see numbers like that coming out about the draft, I mean, the narratives are only going to get worse and worse. You know, all these Alabama picked up another 10 hypothetical wins, I think, over the weekend with the amount of draft picks that their conference had, right? I mean, that will just happen more and more and more. And listening to the way I was hearing guys talk about that nationally, I just thought, man, that this is not going to be good for fighting some of those narratives as the Big 12 moves forward.
That's why when you have somebody 4th and 13 in a chance to go play in a big game, you got to somehow make the play, sack, knock it down, or maybe someone drops a pass. But Arizona State was so close. And it is an uphill battle. The money gets more and more. It's not going to change unless you just start winning those games, which is going to be hard to do because you're playing up against the current anyway. We had the Clanderman. We had his audio from last week, John, about Kleiman having to sit down with some 2 or 3 dozen players to tell them they no longer had a room on the roster. And yet the next day, Judge Wilkin sends the attorneys or whoever for the NCAA back to the timeout corner. Get this done on the roster limits. Does that affect those who have already been told they're not going to have room? Can that be retroactive? How is that working out?
Yeah, I mean, it's honestly a good question. I've meant to do a little bit more poking around on that because, I mean, look, Kleiman he spent the first 5 minutes of one of his press conferences this spring, going after how much he hated that rule because, this again is a guy who's the ultimate player's coach. And he has all these players that want to be there, want to be a part of the program. He does not want to have to tell them hey guys, you got to go. And so he was dreading having to do that from a human standpoint, but also, just your roster standpoint. I mean, for instance, at running back right now, they have 5 running backs on the roster. You probably want more 7 or 8. And normally that would be very doable. You'd have 5 scholarship and a couple walk-ons. Well, they had a couple of the walk-ons go, and now they're back searching the spring portal for another back to add just because numbers wise, you definitely need one more in the fold there. So it presents all these tricky problems. And, Kleiman called college football on the field great, but off the field a disaster. And I think that's, this is how do you argue with him? I mean, it's just such a mess and a situation that there's obviously no leadership now, but they're in this position because there hadn't been good leadership in years. But yeah, I mean, literally Kleiman did it. The timing when K-State did that was made so that guys could still have 2 days to get into the portal. So they're doing that out of the kindness of their own heart. Hey, we want these guys to be able to have a chance to get in the portal and go play somewhere. And then because of that, they kind of screw themselves because had they just waited another 24 hours and made that an even worse time crunch for all those players, they could have still kept them there. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I'm sure they are furious about all that. I don't know if any or many of those guys are going to come back, because at that point it's is the relationship fractured? Now the guys, know where they stood. You basically played your hand already. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on with all those guys, but it's not something people are talking about as much because it's not going to be the most consequential thing to what's actually happening out there on the fall. But I do think it's as good an example as you could probably produce right now of just what a state of disarray and chaos the entire sport is in right now.
I do want to ask you one basketball question because the Big 12, everybody's dealing with this, but the Big 12 elites in a lot of regard have been hit so hard by the portal and just the new era of teams starting from one guy who was a redshirt in building up or no people at all in their rosters. How have you seen it come through for Kansas State, who I know didn't lose as many guys, but they had a lot of guys that just didn't fit, like Accor, and then Doug McDaniel went to Memphis, and they have all this. How do you see K-State and Jerome Tang bouncing back from last year, especially since the roster did need at least a good shake to it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a messy offseason. We'll see. I guess I'll start with this. Jerome Tang was speaking over the weekend And I know like Dream Dowling, one of the assistants, had this public speaking opportunity for Jerome Tang up on his Instagram story. And he was very defiant, like, hey, we're going to be back and better than ever. So, I mean, he seems to be very confident, and they have operated largely in the shadows this year. They're doing a lot of work in Europe. I think they feel like they have 2 guys committed in Europe and maybe working on another over there, which, you know, I sure hope that comes through, because otherwise, I mean, they've got a lot of roster spots to fill that we don't really publicly know about who's going to fill them right now. You know, Jerome Tang said late in the season, like, hey, I want to kind of alter this. It looks like the Houston model may actually be more the way to do this, higher roster retention instead of, you know, hey, clear house, go spend a bunch of money and pull in the best talent that money can buy, that sort of strategy. And I think that's been proven out in a lot of ways. There have been a lot of the analytics guys that have given you the numbers on returning production of teams that made the Elite Eight, Final Four, et cetera. And it really is not as great a way to go as maybe people thought, to just go spend your way to a totally new roster. Unfortunately, it was like, you know, they got to the offseason. I think they wanted to keep Brendan Hassan. I think the idea originally was to keep Doug McDaniel. A lot of these guys, or a handful anyway, that they wanted to keep around did wind up leaving for one reason or another. And so they're kind of in the same position for a 3rd straight year. You know, I mean, they came in and immediately had to replace everybody but Marquise Noel and Ish Massoud, which went very well. Since then, the results have been much more mixed, and I just feel like they're having to do it again. I don't know whether or not you feel better or worse from like a risk aversion standpoint by taking the European guys as opposed to, you know, transfer portal kids that you might be a little bit more familiar with. How does their game translate from Europe? But I know people are doing it all over the place. Brad Underwood just posted a picture of himself today, like where he was in Serbia or whatever, you know, I mean, so people are embracing it. But I guess the long story short is, like, I'm throwing up my hands a little bit on it at this point. Last year it was really easy to get very excited about the transfer portal additions. 2 years ago, I mean, it felt like not only did they have some good additions, but they were really close, like painstakingly close to like guys like Max Asmus, where it would have been a phenomenal portal class. This year, my attitude has been much more like, all right, like, I'm just not going to get too high or too low. Roll out the ball when the season gets here. I'll see what the roster looks like then. I'll judge it then. It's just, it does feel like the Jerome Tang era. It's always been just like a wild ride, these off seasons, with what they're trying to do. There've been a bunch of twists and turns. I mean, another one just happened here recently. I think they felt really good about a guard, Jordan Ross from St. Mary's, and that kind of fell apart. And now it looks like he's probably headed to Georgia. So I don't know. That's a long way to say, like, I really don't know what to tell you about basketball. I mean, but it's been a roller coaster. I'll say it that way.
No, it seems like it does. The wind blows and it turns a different direction. And who knows if there's, even if they get the settlement done, is it protected? You know what I mean? I mean, even then, it looks like it's going to be in the courtroom as much as anything else. John, thank you. Good stuff. Thank you. I know you said I needed to get out at 5. Sorry, we took you a little bit later than that, but we do appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Hey, anytime, guys. Take care.
John Kurtz, Kansas City Sports Network, on a bunch